Since the dawn of time, people have looked up at the evening sky and dreamed of traveling to Earth's nearest neighbor. On July 20th, 1969, as Neil Armstrong started down the ladder to the lunar surface, a dream as old as humanity was about to come true. In the years leading up to this moment, the American space program was plagued with failures and death. Many of the world's top scientists were certain a moon landing was impossible. This is the incredible story of the historic flight of Apollo 11. It was against the backdrop of the Cold War that the American and Russian race to the moon emerged. With the early Russian successes in space, the truly fearful West believed that Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was fully capable of making good on his boast that the entire world would someday sleep under a red communist moon. The early American effort in space, however, proved disastrous at nearly every turn. As the entire world watched in wonder, the U.S. news media aptly supplied wide coverage to several ruinous missions, in sharp contrast to the highly guarded, top-secret Russian space program, of which little or nothing was known.
We were on the verge of having a robust capability that could take us to the moon. At least we could conceive of what it would look like on paper. But the actual systems we had at the time were relatively fragile and relatively unreliable. I remember looking at film of launches, frankly, most of which seemed to end up in a disaster rather than a successful launch to space.
I believe this was probably the most dangerous period of space flight because the spaceships that we were flying were not particularly reliable. We had lost the Mercury Atlas 1 and 3 missions. Prior to the John Glenn, we had had problems on several of the Atlases. The technology was very primitive at that period of time.
Thus, at the height of the Cold War, the American Space Agency NASA held a distant and dismal second place to the formidable Russian space program, and America seemed destined to remain permanently overshadowed in space by the seemingly superior Russian program. The beginnings of the American successes that was to ultimately culminate with Apollo 11 started to surface during Project Mercury. During these missions, lone astronauts rode spacecraft into Earth orbit. Although fine accomplishments in and of themselves, the Americans were still a long way from walking on the moon's surface. Upon the completion of Project Mercury, NASA moved into Project Gemini, which was capable of transporting 2 astronauts. Still, the remaining technological hurdles were nothing short of daunting.
You got to remember, Mercury was not a maneuverable vehicle. Go ahead, that's all. No maneuver capability. So that was the first thing we wanted to do, was maneuver. The second thing we wanted to do was, could it go find somebody up there? Could it go do a job up there? Could it go rendezvous with something? Could it go dock with something? Could you attach a rocket to it and go to someplace else? Those were all the things we were thinking about when we came to Gemini.
There were 4 major objectives of the Gemini program. Computer-controlled re-entry to improve guidance that would contribute to return from the moon guidance. That was one objective. Rendezvous of spacecraft was another objective, so that we could do lunar orbit rendezvous to come back from the moon. Long-duration flight, so that we could assure that the human could exist comfortably, or at least survive up to 2 weeks, which was the longest possible lunar mission that we might have. That was another objective. The final objective of the Gemini program, number 4, was space walking, or EVA. so we could convince ourselves that we could build the spacesuits and the human could operate independent of the spacecraft on the lunar surface. So all those 4 objectives really bridged the gap between Mercury and Apollo.
Project Gemini required not only perfection of brand new hardware, but the creation of new techniques to deal with time delays and testing the procedures for getting a spacecraft to the moon. An additional challenge was utilizing the vehicle's own pilot craft as the platform to return to Earth. Just as momentum was building within the U.S. space program, tragedy struck. 2 astronauts, Elliot See and Charles Bassett, died in a plane crash during their Gemini training. Later, several other astronauts narrowly survived near-fatal accidents during the testing of the new Gemini technology. Given the monumental task and pace before them, many more things could have gone horribly wrong.
So it again was kind of a spooky experience. As again we learned, and by the way, felt that we were being smiled on and watched over by someone smarter than us, because any of the things that we had run into could have turned out much worse than they did.
It was the mission of the Apollo program to master each technological feat and then land on the moon. Believing that astronaut casualties were now behind them, NASA forged ahead. Tragically, the 3 astronauts of the very first Apollo, Apollo 1, were instantly killed during a routine ground test. A flash fire in the capsule caused by a short circuit instantly ended the lives of talented astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. With NASA's moon goal seemingly beyond reach, little time was lost and the overall effort was accelerated. Apollo 8 successfully orbited the moon. Apollo 9 tested the lunar lander in Earth orbit. And Apollo 10 took the lander module to the moon as a dress rehearsal for the lunar landing. Each mission was integral to the first lunar landing attempt that was to be Apollo 11.
I think if there was anything that got us there, it was the tremendous effort of the people we had. And I think that can't be emphasized too greatly in Apollo. It was the people that did it and not any machines or any inventions or any one particular people's courage or astronaut courage or anything like that. It was an effort of a large number of people who really devoted their entire life to making it happen.
The crew of Apollo 11 was comprised of some of the most experienced and best trained of all astronauts. However, at the time missions were being assigned, no one knew which flight would be the historic trip to the moon. Apollo 11 commander was astronaut Neil Armstrong, a proven veteran of the Gemini program. In March 1966, he had previously commanded the first mission to rendezvous and dock with a target vehicle in space in Gemini 8. After he and his crewmate Dave Scott successfully docked with the target vehicle, a malfunctioning thruster caused the 2 spacecraft to spin out of control. Armstrong skillfully undocked the 2 vehicles without damage, although his spacecraft continued to spin to the point where both men nearly lost consciousness and the spacecraft almost spun out of control and off into outer space. In an amazingly cool manner, Armstrong identified the problem and stabilized the spacecraft with only seconds to spare. It was this sure confidence that earned Armstrong the commander post of the Apollo 11 mission. Those same skills once again saved Armstrong only weeks before the historic Apollo 11 mission. In the course of testing a research model of the lunar landing training vehicle, the vehicle malfunctioned and careened out of control. Again, with only seconds to spare, Armstrong ejected less than 75 meters just before the vehicle crashed. Had Armstrong remained inside, the accident would surely have resulted in his certain death. Armstrong's crewmate in the trip to the lunar surface was Colonel Buzz Aldrin, third in his class at West Point, who received a PhD in orbital mechanics from MIT prior to becoming an astronaut. It was Aldrin who more or less single-handedly rescued the Gemini program when he developed new spacewalk techniques during Gemini 12. Aldrin's successes in the last Gemini mission gave NASA the boost in confidence they needed to proceed with an aggressive moon landing schedule, and earned Aldrin his seat next to Armstrong on Apollo 11. The third crewmate on Apollo 11 was Michael Collins, another experienced Gemini astronaut who drew an assignment unique among astronauts. His mission was to remain in the orbiting command module while his crewmates used the lunar lander to descend to the moon. Collins was an expert in the techniques of rendezvous and docking, owing to his experience in Gemini 10 with John Young. During that mission, they rendezvoused and docked with two unmanned Agena vehicles and then used the Agena's boosters to set new altitude records. Originally, Collins was assigned to the first manned mission to orbit the moon on board Apollo 8, but was forced off that flight as a result of a bone spur in his neck that required minor surgery. He was later reassigned to the next available flight, Apollo 11. With a series of impressive accomplishments to their credit, the crew members of Apollo 11 were ready to take their place in history when launch day came on July 16, 1969.
Well, every launch day is a time of excitement, enthusiasm, and apprehension. But I think in most circumstances, you always feel that the chances of actually lifting off are fairly distant or remote. And you have to temper your enthusiasm with the realization that, in fact, you may be coming back in and trying to go another day. I think the most memorable thing that I can recall about that particular day was the opportunity while my two friends here were being put into the spacecraft to stand alone by myself out there and look at the rocket, quietness, and see the sun come up and waves rolling in, and evidence of the millions of people watching, but nothing specific, and just so quiet. To realize that indeed that the contrast was going to take place, all the frantic activity preparing the rocket was so quiet up there for me personally. And that in a very few moments we were going to be departing in a great roar off of this event.
Apollo 11 proved to be a textbook launch, setting the crew on course for their appointment with the moon. However, excitement was cautiously kept in check by the knowledge that space travel is a very unforgiving undertaking.
There are so many things that can go wrong on a trip to the moon and back. It's sort of a long and fragile daisy chain of events.
Of course, all three of us had flown in orbit before and seen the wonders of Earth as seen from space. This was a new experience for us in seeing it from a fairly long distance away. It does probably have a change in character as you become farther away. I think you most notice that, though, at the time you leave Earth. When you're departing at a great rate, it's very clear that this is an unusual experience.
Capcom, we're go for TLI.
Roger. Guys, I've got the word you wanted to hear. You are go for TLI. You're go for the moon.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. How do you read? Apollo 11, this is Houston. Radio check, over.
3 hours after liftoff, the Apollo Command Module moved forward to extract the lunar module from the third stage of the launch vehicle. Both were moving at 17,000 miles an hour, and afterwards the crew settled in for the 3-day trip to the moon.
Oh, loud and clear now, Mike, and we understand that you are Doc. That's right.
From our point of view, the command module was a wonderful improvement over our previous spacecraft. It was really fun. So we enjoyed the luxury of a big volume machine.
I thought we had amazingly good accommodations. We had hot and cold water. The food was even edible. All in all, it was a nicely packaged small enclosure, and we could comfortably have stayed there far in excess of 8 days.
I think it was a treat. It was certainly a major step upward. It was a marvel of technology, and had the company of two enjoyable people to keep us occupied. I think occasionally we'd get to drag a little bit on, I think, in a very long duration mission inside the command service module. But thanks to the experiences that we'd had previously in flight, we saw to it that there were adequate windows, and quite a few of them, to look out.
After traveling more than 250,000 miles across the emptiness of space, the spacecraft finally reached the moon and was readied for lunar orbit.
The thing about the moon that I thought was peculiar was that it seemed to depend on the angle of the sun. When the sun was almost overhead and it was noon down below, the moon appeared to be a warm and a friendly place. On the other hand, near dawn or dusk, it became very foreboding looking. The craters cast very long shadows, and the place looked distinctly unfriendly. So I was intrigued by the contrast based purely on what angle the sun happened to be coming from.
On the morning of July 20th, the anticipated moment of lunar orbit and descent had arrived. However, the true test of many years of preparation lay just ahead. Armstrong and Aldrin entered their lunar lander, named Eagle, and powered up the systems while Collins remained in the command module.
The spacecraft is behind the moon, and we go into what we call battle short in the control center. Battle short is where we actually physically block the circuit breakers and the main feeders for this building, such that if we'd have a power fault, we'd prefer to burn up the circuit rather than have that circuit breaker open prematurely. As soon as GC says, hey, we're in battle short condition, we lock the doors to the room because we don't want anybody walking in and distracting us at critical times.
The first thing I heard was the flight director, Gene Kranz, come on the intercom, and he gave us a speech that I think General Patton would have been proud of. He said, "Folks, we're here. We are going to succeed. You've been trained. You know what to do, and we're going to go do it." But then he said something was even better. He said, "But no matter how it turns out, I'm going to be with you, and no matter what you do, I'm going to be right behind you." And you can't imagine what that meant to a bunch of young fellows who, like myself, were only 25 or 26 years old.
Okay, all flight controllers going around the horn, gonna go for undocking.
Okay, retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go.
Capcom, we're go for undocking.
Hello, Eagle Houston, we're standing by, over. Eagle Houston, we see you on the steerable, over. Roger, Eagle, undocked. Roger, how does it look? Eagle has wings. Roger. 000 9 or
I think
8.
perhaps the final descent to the lunar surface
Plus,
was,
correction,
for me, the highlight of the flight. It's very challenging, a lot of unknowns,
00085.
and it was, for a pilot, it was a wonderful experience.
030
As soon as the comm came in good and solid, we saw good telemetry data. The first thing that happened was I saw that there was a 20 foot per second velocity error in the onboard computer. Now that came from the fact that we'd started at the wrong place. We just couldn't predict perfectly where we were going to be and what speed we were going to be when we started the descent. The problem is, at 35 feet per second, we have to abort. So here we are riding right along this abort ledge, just inside it, and wondering, is this an initial error or is this something that's going to grow? Because if we had an accelerometer problem, a gyro problem, it was going to grow. We were going to have to call an abort. And that was something that was going to be my call, and I dreaded this sort of thing all along.
Okay, all flight controllers, gonna go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guidance, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
Altitude 4200. Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Looking great.
Everything is good. We're back on track. I thought, boy, this is things are going to work out fine.
Go. Guidance, you happy? Go.
30 seconds later, after I thought things were going to work out fine, we got the first program alarm. If you listen to the tape, the crew talks about it first. You hear Neil Armstrong say, 1201, program alarm.
Program alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
1201 sounds as four little numbers, sounds sort of ah-ho-hum, but what it really means is, hey bud, I had too much to do that last second. I didn't get it all done, and I hope that I've done the most important things. And it's up to you to figure out if I've done the most important things, because I'm going on, I can't stop. And that's what that was all about.
000 9 or 8.
Well, when I saw those come up, my first thought, uh-oh, abort, you know, a computer, because always doing a simulation, a computer glitch like that was the data dropped out, the computer stopped computing, and everything just went to, you know, hell in a handbasket.
030.
Just as the ground control engineers were trying to come to grips with understanding what caused the 1201 alarm, another series of alarms went off, indicating another potential situation hindering the moon descent.
Eagle looking great. Roger, 1202, we copy it.
Now, what we were concerned about, there's another computer alarm, which was called a PUDU, which means do program 00. Program 00 is where the computer says, hey, I don't have enough time to do anything. I'm going to go to idle and wait for further instructions. We were worried that we might force ourselves into that particular type alarm, and there we would have to, we'd be in the, we'd either have to be in a landing position, select the abort guidance system and try to land or abort. I mean, that was a bad case.
I look around and I see it's not coming too fast. I see that the velocity's okay, the altitude's okay. And about 10 seconds after the alarm, we call a go. I said, flight, we're going that alarm.
Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm. Roger, we got you. We're going that alarm.
Good radar data. We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good.
Just right when the crew really needed it, because they called down and said, how are we doing? What's going on? Which is their way of saying, hey, what's going on? Give us a quick reading. We said go very confidently, and they put their head back in the cockpit and kept flying.
Altitude, velocity, light.
The tension in mission control was so real you could cut it with a knife, and I'm just babbling along on these, you know, giving them updates and this and that and the other. And Deke Slayton was sitting right next to me during that final few minutes, and about the last minute, he hit me in the side and said, whispered, "Shut up, Charlie, and let them land." And so I got real quiet.
Velocity light.
I get a call from the controllers that says, hey, we've hit the DIPS, which is Descent Propulsion System, low-level discrete. And that sets my mental clock running and the clock of all the controllers in the room running that, hey, we only got 2 minutes of hover time, hover fuel remaining. And we know the crew isn't down near the surface yet. And pretty soon this clock, this time starts moving agonizingly slow down here. And then next call we get is 60 seconds. We still haven't landed in the moon, and we're well beyond our experience base for landing there. We get another call at 45 seconds, still haven't landed.
In our simulations, we're accustomed to having a large number of these kinds of difficulties, and we had in fact simulated landing with very small amounts of fuel left, so I didn't feel that this was an oppressive situation. Not that we weren't concerned about it, we certainly were, because they're serious matters.
We get down at 30 seconds, we get a 30-second call, and at this time, over the voice path from the crew, the airground from the crew, you start hearing we're kicking up dust. So we now knew we were pretty close down to the surface, at which time all we did from then on, we weren't communicating with the crew except for very terse call-outs on time. 30 seconds, 15 seconds.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
We were close. I think we were within 10 to 7 seconds of fuel before we landed. We were about 6 seconds away from the ground calling abort. That wouldn't have been my call. That would have been another engineer's in this room. But he was within a few seconds.
My problem was I had to keep talking, I had to keep working, because I had a series of stay-no-stay decisions that we had to make. Because in case the LEM spacecraft had been damaged during the descent, or some of the temperatures, possibly we got into a soft landing area where it started to tip off, we had to be ready to abort at any time. So I had to keep my controllers, my entire team grinding away for what we call the T1 stay-no-stay decision.
The things you have to hang on to are your buddies down here that are right there with you, and the flight director is going to stand behind you no matter what. And even though you're scared, you can function and operate. Now, I'm not saying everybody in this room was scared. I was always scared. I was scared during the sim. I was scared during the mission. I don't have any problem saying that.
The technological problems of landing aside, at least one renowned scientist had great fears as to whether Armstrong and Aldrin would even survive the landing. Some predicted that the dust covering the moon's surface would explode upon contact with the lunar lander's engines.
That issue arose because of a scientist by the name of Thomas Gold, who tended to take a little bit of data and make extreme extrapolations from it. And he convinced a senator and some high-ranking NASA officials that this was a problem, that the moon dust would ignite. There was a piece of evidence that he had from the pictures from the Surveyor spacecraft that showed that dust was collecting on the spacecraft, and this meant it was hopping around with electrical charges and get in the Apollo module and ignite and so on.
Ultimately, this fear proved groundless, and the first successful landing on the moon's surface became history. For the moment, the crew had to push aside any remaining anxiety and anticipation for their walk on the moon. There was still work to be done and checkouts to be performed inside the lunar excursion module before venturing outside. Through the window of the Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin took in what no human had seen before.
We had hours to stand there a mere 15 feet, say, above the surface and look at pretty much everything that was available out the front windows. We had a sense of the gravity, the character of the environment there. So long before we actually got out on the surface, we already had pretty good appreciation for what the moon was like.
The crew, as they had been trained, were looking out the windows, and they were describing the terrain that we had landed in. As the crew was describing this, I could see the puzzlement on the controllers' faces that said, this isn't where we expected to be. Well, that was obvious because we had landed long. But we thought from the crew description we'd be able to plot the position, and the geologists in the back room were confused.
On Sunday, July 20th, 1969, almost 7 hours after touchdown, it was a go for the crew's historic moonwalk. As more than 1 billion people simultaneously watched on their televisions, momentarily brought together by this unprecedented event, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin readied themselves to turn an age-old dream into reality. Tempering the astronauts' eager anticipation to walk the lunar surface was the lingering fear of potential danger and death.
And that the astronauts would step off out of the spacecraft and sink out of sight if the spacecraft hadn't already sunk out of sight, that they needed snowshoes to walk around because there was going to be all this incredible depth of dust and so on.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Are you getting a TV picture now, Houston?
Neil, yes, we are getting a TV picture. You're in our field of view now.
Okay, ready for me to come out? All set. Okay, I'm on the top step. It's a very simple matter to hop down from one step to the next. You've got 3 more steps and then a long one. Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down to about the 4th rung up. There you go. Okay, now I think I'll do the same.
The first thing you do, first thing we did when we got out of that spacecraft was go get some rocks. Do nothing else, just just pick up some rocks, put them in a bag, and put that in the spacecraft in case we have to get the hell out of there. That's what we did. Okay, we've done that and we're satisfied everything's okay on the moon. Now we'll go put out the instruments. We did that. What's the minimum instruments you can have on this flight? Because we don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the moon. We want to get off of there. We want to come back and think about all this stuff and make sure that we did it right and that everything was okay.
I think I was relieved by the ease that we had in being able to maneuver around. Perhaps impressed by the talcum powder nature of the fine surface itself. As you look at a blueprint, it just was so smooth, just like you'd just put your foot in talcum powder. It was just a many-faceted moon. It was a stranger to me before the mission, but I now look back at it as somewhat of a friend, a place that I've visited.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation. Tyler is very, very fine powder, isn't it? Isn't it fine? Hey, Neil, didn't I say we might see some purple rocks? Find the purple rocks? Yep. very small.
With about
sparkly,
2.5 hours allocated for the moonwalk, most of the time was dedicated to collecting rocks, planting the American flag, and erecting a few key scientific experiments.
When we first had the interface with the scientists, the paleontologists, planetologists, and the geologists, and the seismologists, and all those learned doctors, they didn't like us worth a damn. They wanted to do all this fancy science on the moon. That wasn't our job at the time. Our job was to get that goddamn thing there and back safely. The guys that flew in it safely. And I would say, look, don't bother me with that now. Tell me what's the minimum amount I can do to satisfy you, and let me go get it done.
One of the experiments consisted of a package to detect moonquakes and meteorite impacts, while a laser-ranging reflector helped to accurately measure Earth-Moon distances, and a solar wind experiment detected particles of solar wind blowing onto the lunar surface.
When we're on the surface of the moon, even though the Earth was only a slight 24 degrees off the vertical, there was no traction on my part to divert my attention from where we were and what we were doing, to look up at it, except for the one time when we tried to take a moving picture, or a stirring picture, a memorable picture. And certainly, in retrospect, we looked awfully small. Personally, there was a time when an ironic thought sort of filtered through my mind that here Neil and I were so far away from home, much further than people have ever been, and yet at that same time there were more thoughts, concerns back so far away on what it is that we were doing at that very moment.
After 2 hours and 31 minutes, the astronauts completed their work on the moon and returned to their lunar lander. With no wind or rain on the moon, the footprints of Armstrong and Aldrin will remain for centuries. Astronaut Collins remained behind to pilot the command module named Columbia and was orbiting the moon. During this time, he had occasion for much serious contemplation. A minor functional error could leave him floating in space forever.
Well, I enjoyed being in the command module by myself. It was a happy little home. All the machinery was working properly, and my concerns were not within the command module, but simply that something might go wrong with the LEM, with the lunar module, and these two guys might get stuck on the surface of the moon. That was my main concern.
Pass in, back into lunar orbit.
Capcom, Ecom, Surgeon, GNC. Guidance, you happy? Go. Fido. Go. Capcom, we're go for liftoff.
Tranquility Base, Houston, you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway.
Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the entire mission was the ascent phase, when the astronauts lifted off from the lunar surface. Nearly every system of the mission was equipped with backups, double redundant machinery and equipment, with the exception of one. There could be only one lightweight engine that would lift the crew up and off the lunar surface. If the engine failed to start, astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin would have become permanent monuments on the moon.
Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride. There's that one playground there.
Thousand feet high, 80 feet per second vertical rise.
Eagle Houston, you're looking good at 2. Ping, zags, and misspin all agree.
On July 21st, the ascent engine performed perfectly, and the Eagle spacecraft and crew
Eagle
said
Houston,
goodbye
going right
to the
down
moon.
track. Everything's great.
For Commander Collins and the command module, the approaching Eagle was a welcome sight. After docking together, Armstrong, Aldrin, and their priceless cargo of moon rocks were transferred into the command module. The lunar lander was jettisoned and ultimately fell back and crashed on the moon. The crew was anxious to return home, but they were still 3 days and 250,000 miles away.
The key thing is this business that we're in is absolutely intolerant of carelessness, neglect, incapacity. There's a lot of surprises. There's a high risk. There's nothing conservative about the business that we're in. Basically, we hold back until we are absolutely sure that our job is done. Then we will sit back and we'll celebrate.
On July 24th, Apollo streaked across the heavens headed towards Earth at 25,000 miles an hour, and the Navy rescue team was right there to greet them when the parachutes came out.
I think in 11, from my personal standpoint, we brought the flags out in. And I think that sort of said, hey, thank God for America, and thank God for this country that has let us work in such a marvelous program. And we passed around cigars in this thing here, and this is when we could smoke in the control center. And people would do this, and we'd light up the cigars. And that was, hey, our thanks to the team. Then we met with the other crews and the program managers. We opened the doors to this room. And these hundreds of people would come into the room, all of whom had one little piece of this mission, but without whom we couldn't have done this mission. There was just a feeling of togetherness, bond, unity, accomplishment. It was just the most marvelous feelings in my entire life that existed in this room.
Due to a very real fear that the astronauts could ferry back with them moon germs or some other alien life form capable of contaminating and killing off all life on Earth, the crew was immediately put into strict quarantine for over 2 weeks. By the middle of August, the journey was over, and the crew was safely returned home to Houston, where they went on to become 3 of the greatest heroes in the history of humanity. Although some argue that the moon missions cost too much for too little, the Apollo program was truly a bargain. It cost taxpayers a sum amounting to only 1/3 of 1% of the gross national product in 1970. Yet the technical and scientific knowledge gained from it was immeasurable and still yields benefits today. In the decades that have passed since those first footsteps on the moon, Apollo 11 remains as one of the greatest achievements in the history of human endeavors. The moon was not the finish line, but merely the first step in the eventual exploration of the universe.
There's an increasing momentum to go back to the moon. Studies of the moon are indicating more and more new reasons why it does make sense to go back, but I'm not in a position to say right now when we might make that next trip.
I'd prefer to see us go to Mars rather than go back to the moon, unless we need the moon as a stepping stone to Mars. It could be that in studying Mars, you will discover that the best way to do it is by way of a base on the moon, and if that turns out to be the case, well and good, but I see the moon really not as an end in itself, but really a stepping stone to deeper space, to Mars and to the planets beyond.
I feel that as humans expand outward, that they should be in a gradual, continuous, self-sustaining way, and I suspect that it will involve visiting the moon simultaneously or in melding together with our growing visits of humans to Mars.
I am encouraged by the fact that there are so many people asking those questions, which seems to assure me that our future has a great deal of promise.
Well, I think a Martian astronaut would probably be better off studying the voyages of Vasco da Gama or Lewis and Clark rather than he would listening to the three people who spent only 8 days out on the road. Round trip for a Mars mission is going to be in the vicinity of 2.5 years, and that's close in duration to those of the early explorers.
I think Mike's right. The trip to Mars is going to be a very long and involved and major segment of a person's life, and there's going to be a lot of times to be thinking about it, discussing it en route, beforehand, and afterward. The nation needs a strong goal, strong objective, and Mars is a much clearer one to use as our compelling drawing force into the future.